The Digestive System, Lesson 6.1, Introduction to Digestion. So, what is digestion? So, if you wanted to think about this a little bit more simply, you could say that this person here was eating an apple. Well, in order for the apple to be broken down and in order for the apple to actually give us the nutrients inside, it has to go through something called the digestive tract. So it goes through our mouth and we chew it up with our teeth and we break it down. It comes down through here through a tube called the esophagus. It comes down into the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, until we eventually poop it out. So that is just a really simple breakdown of the digestive system, but we're actually going to start to look at the little individual parts that I just went through in way more detail. So, like I said before, digestion takes place in a tube called the digestive tract. It begins with our mouth and ends with the anus. And the system's entire job is to ingest food, digest food's nutrients, absorb the nutrients, and eliminate anything ingestible. So, what are those different parts? So, the parts at the start. So, the parts that really start off the digestive system, not necessarily things that are breaking things down, but things that definitely start the digestive system off. So, we have the palate, and the front part of the palate is usually hard, and the back part is usually soft. So, if you put your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you can feel that the front part is sort of hard, and if you move it back slightly, the back part is going to be soft. And then the back part is also attached to the uvula. And then next on your tongue, you have something called salivary glands. And it produces and secretes saliva. And saliva helps break down foods. And it contains an enzyme called amylase. And then we have our teeth, which help break down and rip stuff apart. And we have 4 types of teeth. We have the incisors, we have 8 of those, and they're more for ripping. With the canines, we have 4 of those, and they're for sort of tearing. With premolars, we have 8 of those, and then our molars, which slowly come in as we get older, and we have 12 of those, and they're both mainly used for grinding things. Then, just like in the respiratory system, we have the pharynx, which receives food from the mouth, and it helps with our swallowing reflex. And it's also connected to something called the epiglottis, which is something that helps prevent food from going down the wrong tube. So we don't want food to go down our trachea or our windpipe. We want it to go down our esophagus. Our esophagus is a muscular tube that does peristalsis, which are rhythmic or muscular contractions that help move food along the digestive tract. So this is an example of mechanical digestion and not chemical digestion. So now we have another part of the digestive tract, which are sphincters. So they're essentially valves that control the flow of the digestive system. So if you think back to the cardiovascular system, we had those valves in the heart that prevented backflow. So these are kind of what they do. So we have the cardiac sphincter, which prevents stomach acid, which we'll learn more about later, from going back up into the esophagus. So that's kind of what heartburn is, when stomach acid comes back up and you sort of feel it in your throat area. We have the pleuric sphincter, which allows the passage of partially digested food from the stomach to the duodenum, and we'll learn that that's part of the small intestine. We have the ileocecal sphincter, which allows digested food to pass from the small intestine to the large intestine. And lastly, we have the anal sphincter, which is a group of muscles that controls the release of stool. Layers of the digestive tract. So there are 4 layers of the digestive tract, and they all are sort of like a lining or muscle layer that each do different things. So we'll start off with the mucosa. So it's a mucous membrane layer. Its epithelium is supported by connective tissue and smooth muscle. It lines the lumen, and it contains goblet cells that secrete mucus. Next, we have the submucosa, which is a loose connective tissue that lies beneath the mucosa, and it contains some blood vessels and some lymph nodes. The next we have the muscularis, which is the smooth muscle layer, and there's actually two layers in this section. So we have the inner, which is a circular layer, and then the outer, which is a longitudinal layer. And then the stomach also has a tiny third layer, which is where our oblique muscles are. And lastly, we have the serosa. Most of the digestive tract has serosa. It's the thin outermost layer supported by connective tissue. It also secretes serous fluid and keeps the outer surface of the intestines moist. So now we're going to actually learn about the actual stomach. So we learned how food gets into our mouth, how it's moved down through the esophagus, but then where does it actually go? So from the esophagus, it ends up in the stomach, where the real action happens. So the stomach is best described as a thick-walled J-shaped organ. It's located on the left side of the body, just beneath the diaphragm. Its job is to store food and aid with digestion. Its walls have deep folds, or rugae, and so the rugae sort of expand, and this helps the stomach expand so that when the stomach fills, it has enough room. And then they disappear when the stomach fills. So in the stomach, there is actually something called gastric juice, and you can find this all over the digestive tract. And gastric juices aid in chemical digestion and are found in different parts. The gastric glands secrete the gastric juices. So these are three of the main ones that we're going to be talking about. So pepsin, hydrochloric acid, or HCl if you remember from chemistry, and then mucus. So pepsin digests protein, and we'll learn a little bit more about the digestion of those later. Hydrochloric acid causes the stomach to have high acidity, so a pH of 2, which is really high acidity. Neutral is more around a pH of 7. It kills most of the bacteria, and it also activates pepsinogen, and it changes it to pepsin. And then last one is mucus, and it actually protects the stomach walls. So if you remember, those are the walls that we learned about, from digesting itself. So if you didn't have this, your stomach would actually digest itself, which is pretty crazy. And it's also secreted by goblet cells in the lining. Some other quick facts about the stomach is that food is not absorbed by the stomach, when rather alcohol is. So that's why alcohol gets into your bloodstream faster. Food stays in your stomach for 2 to 6 hours, and something called chyme is a thick soupy liquid that leaves the stomach. Chyme leaves via the pleuric sphincter and enters the duodenum of the small intestine. So now that we know most of the stuff about the stomach, the next place the food travels to is the small intestine. So the small intestine has a length of about 6 meters, and its main job is to absorb nutrients. Its walls contain tiny finger-like projections called villi. Each one of those villi has even tinier ones called microvilli, and microvilli increase the surface area of the small intestine, just like the rugae from the stomach increase it, and this helps with more absorption of nutrients. It then breaks down into 3 parts. So the duodenum is the first 25 centimeters of the intestine. It receives bile from the liver, and then of course bile emulsifies fats, which we'll learn more about later. Its sodium bicarbonate neutralizes the chyme, which remember we learned about from the stomach, and then it also has some insulin that breaks down sugars. The jejunum absorbs sugars, amino acids, fatty acids, and makes up about 2/5 of the small intestine. And then lastly, the ileum measures about 3 meters, and its main job is to absorb nutrients and products such as B12 and bile acids. This is just a super quick list of enzymes in the small intestine. Now, you don't need to know all of these, but you should know some of them, especially ones that break down things like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So I'll just leave this list here for you to study, and we're actually going to come back to these at the end of the lesson when we have more information on them. Okay, so the last part that it almost goes through is the large intestine. So after the small intestine, it makes its way to the large intestine. So it's larger in diameter, but shorter in length. And its main function is the reabsorption of water from chyme. So remember we learned about that thick sort of soupy thing from the stomach, which is chyme. And the large intestine also absorbs salts, vitamins, and stores ingestible materials. It also has 4 main parts, and they are... So the parts of the large intestine are the cecum, the colon, the rectum, and the anus. So the cecum lies just below the small intestine. It has a small projection just coming out of it, which is called the appendix. And the appendix, I'll use my pointer, is located right there. Some people say that the appendix helps fight infection, but we don't really know what it does. The colon has 4 sections: the ascending, which goes up the right side near the liver; the transverse crosses the abdominal cavity below the stomach; the descending, which goes down the left side of the body; and then the sigmoid, which enters the rectum. So you can see the sigmoid is just up here, and then the rectum down there. Speaking of the rectum, that's the place where feces are stored, and it opens up to the anus just below. And then the anus, where defecation occurs, where bacteria, fiber, and ingestible materials form a solid. So that's sort of the end of the line for whatever food you were eating. It's all the nutrients have been absorbed, and now it's going to be excreted from your body. So we looked a little bit at those enzymes before in the small intestine, but now we know a little bit more about how the digestive system works, so I wanted to put it more into a real life situation. So let's say for lunch you have this ham butter sandwich with bread. So I see 3 nutrients there. I see bread, which is a carbohydrate; I see ham, which is protein; and I see butter, which is fats. So when you eat this for lunch, how do those nutrients actually get into your body, or what is produced as a result of those nutrients? So let's take a look at the bread first, or the carbohydrates. So the enzyme that's used to break it down is salivary amylase, or if you remember from the mouth we talked about, that's where it's secreted. And the enzyme also acts in the mouth, so like saliva. And the nutrients get broken down into simple sugars or monosaccharides. Next, let's look at the ham. So the ham nutrient is obviously protein. And 3 examples of enzymes digest proteins are pepsin, trypsin, and aminopeptidase. And pepsin is produced in the stomach, while the other 2 are produced in the pancreas. And where they act on is pepsin acts in the stomach, and the other 2 act in the small intestine. And they all get broken down at the end of the day into amino acids. And the last one, the nutrient that butter makes, is fats. And the enzyme is lipase. That's really the only one you can use. And it's produced in the pancreas, and it acts on the small intestine. And what it eventually gets broken down to is glycerol and fatty acids. So there's a little bit of a difference here on how the bread, the ham, and the butter get broken down and how the nutrients are absorbed. So the carbohydrates and the proteins go through a little bit of a simpler process. So their nutrients are absorbed into the vessel of the villus, and sugars or amino acids enter the blood capillaries, and then the nutrients are then carried back to the body through the blood. But in order for the fats or the lipids to be absorbed, fats must be emulsified first by the bile. Then emulsified fats are then broken down into the fatty acid. They're then absorbed into the lacteals of the villi and then into the blood. So then it kind of joins back in with the carbohydrates and the protein. So hopefully this little real life example and this chart gives you a better understanding of how things are actually broken down and how our body uses the nutrients in return. So that's it on the digestive system.